Welcome, everybody, to this Comment Magazine author conversation. I'm Jeff Reimer. I am an editor for Comment Magazine, magazine of public theology. This is our latest issue. It's on the church. So subscribe if you haven't already, but thanks for being here. I'm beaming in from Central Kansas. Together with our marketing director, Matt Crummy, I make up the Great Plains Bureau of Comment Magazine. Just thanks for being here. Yeah. First thing, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us, your name will be there, but tell us where you're coming from, and if you want to, in a few words, why you wanted to join. So we'll hopefully have an active chat box going as we talk today. Okay, I'll give you a little bit of an overview what we're in for this afternoon. Today we're going to have a conversation about silence and time, particularly ways we can steward these two things as a spiritual practice. Our society seems to be terrified of silence, and we've made time into a commodity and atomized it and fragmented it, and that reflects our own practices and priorities. It seems like these two things are connected, but I don't want to get into that too much yet because our two guests today, Elizabeth Oldfield and Aryana Petrosky, have written two beautiful and thought-provoking essays on just these topics. So we will let them speak to the connections as we have our Q&A. For now, I want to say that partly why I'm hosting this is because these two things are what you might call my jam, if you can call silence and time your jam. I spent a fair bit of time at a Benedictine monastery down the road from us, fumbling my way towards silence in fits and starts, and have benefited from that greatly. That monastery has a particular dedication to contemplation and silence, and to the Virgin Mary. But if you want to learn about the Virgin Mary, you'll have to go to our YouTube page and watch Brian Dykema's conversation with Margarita Mooney Clayton. And Dykema, if you're out there, you can pay me for the plug later. But I've also benefited greatly from immersing myself into the church's rhythms as a way of life and as a tool for my own devotional practice. So let me introduce Elizabeth and Aryana real quick. Elizabeth is the host of the Sacred podcast, and she's the former director of the Theos think tank. She appears regularly in the media, including BBC One, Sky News, The World Service, and the Financial Times. She's a regular speaker at conferences and chairs them as well. Before joining Theos in August of 2011, Elizabeth worked for the BBC TV and radio, and she also has got her theology chops at the King's College in London. She also has a book coming out in May. It's your first book, right? So look for that. I think Brazos in the States, and did you say Hodder and Stoughton in the UK?
Hodder in the UK.
Aryana Petrosky is a senior manager of partnerships and projects at Redeeming Babel, a nonprofit that creates content to equip Christians with resources for navigating a complex world. She is also a writer and poet, which is clear from her essay in the current issue of Comment. Their contributions are in the current issue of Comment magazine. Okay, here's what we're going to do next. Elizabeth and Aryana, I want you each to give about a 5-minute overview of what you're doing and what you're saying in your essay, and for those especially who haven't read it, but for those of us who have, as a refresher. Then we'll take about 30 minutes or so for a conversation among the three of us, and then we'll open it up for Q&A at the end for 10 or 15 minutes. And to all our guests, as we are talking, feel free to contribute your questions via the chat. I'll keep it open here and I'll look for them. And Mariah will keep us all in check this whole time. So, okay, let's get going. Aryana, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for all of you who are participating in this webinar. It's a real joy to get to talk about silence and time, two things that can be quite abstract, but also very tangible. So my piece is kind of about my experience at Grand Champ. It's a Protestant convent located in Switzerland. I first went there as a guest for just, I think it was like 2 nights. And then I went back a few months later for 3 weeks as a volunteer. And as a volunteer, you're really expected to be immersed in the life of the community and participate in the rhythms of the community. So at Grand Champ, they spend their time in silence, other than prayer, which happens in the morning, noon, evening, and compliant hours. It's in French, which I did not understand. So, but it was very beautiful. And they use the Taizé liturgy. So when I was there, I felt this kind of novelty to silence that I hadn't experienced before. And I also started to uncover this really unique history of Protestant monasticism, which I had no idea existed, and was thrilled to find out that there were these Protestant monasteries created around the time of World War II, kind of responding to the turmoil of the era. And a lot of these communities had the particular emphasis of unity and reconciliation as a part of their vocation. And I think silence is very integral to this calling of communal life, a calling to liturgy and really intentional living. And then my piece really tries to, at the start, describe what silence is, because that's it can be abstract. And I think the novelty of my experience at Grand Champ was experiencing silence in a way that felt like it was its like own entity. It had a presence to it that I hadn't ever experienced before. So I kind of identify three things or three textures of silence, which there are probably many more. But the first one is that silence is laborious. It feels heavy. It's almost a strain. It takes a lot of effort. And then the second was that silence is like a desert. It feels expansive. It feels like you're walking through exile at times. There's emptiness to it. And then eventually, I think silence softens. It becomes something that is kind and generative in a very joyous way. It can be playful, it can be creative, it can be something that gives new life. And I think I probably still experience all three of those things every time I enter into silence. And then the rest of the piece, I actually use Jonah as kind of a model for this experience of silence. As much as this piece is about silence, it's also about grief. And I had this imagery of being in the belly of the whale and I think Jonah, he's in the storm, he's on the ship, it's loud, it's chaotic, he's running away from God. And I think for our modern time, and even in my own life, that storm often alienates us from our own self as well as from God. And when we don't take time to pause and we are caught up in the storm of our life, that alienation is kind of what the product of that storm. And then the second piece being cast into the water, being cast into the belly of the whale, and almost a forced time to be silent. I think silence can be chosen. It can also happen to us unexpectedly. and in very prolonged ways. And there, in the silence of the belly whale expression, we're forced there and it's not chosen. There's an opportunity to be reminded of who we are and who God is. It's kind of a reclaiming of our identity in Christ, partially because all of the noise and distraction that we use to escape those things have been silenced. And then the third kind of phase is this transformation and being spit out onto a new shore. And I think silence ultimately has this kind of purifying element to it. It can be prophetic. It can be unveiling of what, I mean, for example, even COVID was that time for a lot of people, that kind of forced silence that then unveiled all the ways we wish the world was different. And for the church in particular, I think there's an opportunity for silence in a communal setting to show how far we may have drifted from God and how far we may have drifted from his purposes for the church and the world. So those are kind of that's like the map. And then I end with an encouragement that people should give silence a try, even if it's as simple as 10 minutes a day. But that's kind of the summary of the journey of the piece.
Thank you. Elizabeth, tell us about your piece.
Yes, I got interested in time because one of the things that I was writing about for the book that I have coming out was acedia, which is this kind of forgotten concept, the original word that was in the 7 deadly sins and usually gets translated sloth, but like shalom doesn't really translate exactly to peace. Acedia has many more meanings within it than just sloth, and in fact it's closer to a kind of spiritual apathy or distraction, listlessness, restlessness, failure to attend to the important things. And that felt like the kind of defining temptation of our time. I felt fragmented and fractured and harassed, but also exhausted and bored but overstimulated, just living. Abraham Joshua Heschel, writing on the Sabbath, talks about the screech of dissonant days, this sense of like, actually, I'm not in rhythm. I am not moving in rhythm. My days are dissonant and they are screeching. Primarily pandemic, but I think in the lead up to that as well, with young children and juggling work and an increasing addiction to devices. And around the time I was thinking about acedia, we had recently moved into living in community for the first time, which is something we've been planning for a long time. And we had talked about everything. You know, we talked about conflict, we talked about money, we talked about our different personality styles, we visited other contexts, and in the background was this idea of a rule of life that we would need to like decide what to do when, and on Wednesdays who's eating where, but it felt like a very functional part. You know, the vision of the community, what was important, you know, the values, who are we going to be becoming, this exciting visionary thing, of which how we structured our time was just like way down the list of functional things, like who's going to be the one who organizes the home insurance. And over those first few weeks and months living together, which actually coincided with the third big lockdown in the UK, so we did not see anyone else. We did not really leave the house. The children were homeschooling. It became clear that how we structured our time would be who we became as a community, and that rule of life as a way of embodying and instantiating and remaining loyal to the things that we were setting out to do and the people that we wanted to become together was just like beyond foundational. And as I got interested in that, I realized how much in our tradition there is about this, how much, you know, this sense of the gifts that Christian tradition and practice have, helping us structure our time in ways that help us become the kind of people that we want to be in the world. Rowan Williams talks about it as kind of like one of the least appreciated aspects of what religions in general actually is talking about, but Christianity in particular can offer. And so that attention to how I was spending my time, but not just as an individual, in particular, how I was spending my time communally, became extremely central to my sense of what spiritual formation is. And again, the more rigorous we allowed ourselves to be with our commitments to how we were going to spend time, basically the more we removed freedom and choice, which goes against all of our instincts, the more we said, right, we will show up on these days and these times, we will do this, we will be there for prayer. Like no one can miss house night without checking in with everyone else first. Like we will design out the Oliver Burkeman, who I quote in the piece, talks about the autonomy over our own schedules. We will surrender some of the autonomy over our schedules in order to keep collective time together. The better it felt, which is unexpected. And so the piece is really reflecting on that, drawing on this sense of the counterintuitive liberation of communal rhythms, and how again and again we find as humans that the things we think we want and will make us happy are not always the things that will actually make us happy. And it was an invitation to myself and to the church, because I quote Andrew Root, who has this beautiful image of the church previously being the custodian of sacred time, and particularly this image of the monasteries, of the clock of society, and that literally the bodies of the sisters or the brothers in their kneeling and their rising and their fasting and their absolute immovable reliability that they would be praying at this time, they would be working at this time, and no one had to second guess it, and it wouldn't get cancelled, and it would always be there like the ticking of a clock. That kept society able to live fruitfully in time. And that one of the things we have seeded as a church is that sense of ourselves as a custodian of sacred time. And I am finding in the most tiny way a feeling of regaining some of that role in our tiny intentional community.
Thank you. Yeah, like when I've spent time at the monastery, I usually do it over the course of a weekend, and it's such a novelty for me to go and to be immersed in this life of prayer for a couple of days. And the weird thing is always to me that like when I leave, they're still doing it. Like they're doing it today also, and tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day. Like they never stop. This is their life, which amazes me, because usually by a couple of days, I'm like, I'm ready to get out of here, you know. But it's actually a comfort to know that somebody's living that way, that somebody has dedicated their entire life to this. You know, that's just an observation. So let's move into some questions. I'll kind of start, I think, with your essay, Aryana, a little bit, and digging into the themes there. But feel free, either of you, to speak up on any of these questions, because like I said at the beginning, I sense that there's a deep connection between these two themes, between time and silence. So my first question is kind of also mixed in with an observation. A friend told me, made the observation years ago to me, that I think like when you read Thomas Merton talk about silence and solitude, he's really excited about it, and very, very into it. And like silence is this time for like connection and rejuvenation. And when you read Henri Nouwen, he's more of an extrovert. And so like for him, silence is the battle. You know, this is where you go to face your inner demons, and possibly real demons, you know, like, and it's all about struggle and overcoming. And I think your essay does a really great job of drawing out both those aspects. Because I think for some of us, there's it can be a little bit of a personality thing. Like we're drawn to silence because we're the kind of person who likes books and tea and solitude, you know. But others love to be in a crowd, and that's what gives them energy. And so silence and solitude are the sort of this necessary discipline they know that grounds them. Is that it? Were you trying to kind of balance these two, or were you aware of that dynamic as you were writing your piece?
Yeah, I think that's a good observation, and it reflects some of the responses I get when I tell people about silence. Some people will kind of have a guttural response of like, I can never do that. That's my worst nightmare.
And that's the indication that you need it the most.
that- that's usually what I say. Yeah. I do think there is a little bit of a personality component, and even just like formation component. So as much as silence has felt like a novelty within the context of monastic communal life, when I really look back on my life, I was actually introduced to silence at a really young age. I grew up in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and I don't think I realized until as an adult and really recently that it was a very solitary like childhood playing outside. We camped all summer long, and I would just go wander up the stream or into the hills, and that was done in silence. Like I didn't have an I didn't have my like iPod. I wasn't like listening to music. It was just the vastness of the open sky. And so I think there's a formation aspect to desiring silence. And it's actually a question I have is how do you get people to desire silence, especially when they don't think they need it? And I think especially as I've come to DC, I've been in Washington, DC for 6 years now. When I first arrived, I was exhausted and felt like I was a fish swimming upstream with the rhythms of DC life. It's fast paced, it's a very fast paced work culture. And I had a mentor who encouraged me to go on some solitude retreats, and she went on quarterly retreats. And so I started to do that. And I think silence feels scary. And so I think, especially for extroverted people who get their energy from others, like that's terrifying to go spend a weekend in a cabin alone, and in silence. But I think because, especially living in a fast-paced environment, it's sometimes the momentum, and this is probably where some of Elizabeth and I's piece start to overlap here, is it's sometimes the momentum is what keeps you going. And so thinking of stopping that momentum to take a time away from it, it becomes its own idol. It becomes like in self-importance too, especially in DC, that if I stop, the world is going to end, or if I stop, something is going to fall through the cracks, which is actually the opposite. It's when true rest happens, so that we can, and that's why we have Sabbath. Like when we have true rest, we are much more whole as human beings in our approach to work and in our approach to our daily rhythms. And yeah, so I would say it's a both and I want to continue to experiment what it looks like to draw people into practices of silence who don't think they can do it, or are hesitant, because I think there's something really powerful about it in our modern age that we desperately need. And just looking at statistics of anxiety or depression, like I think a lot of that comes from the fact that we never slow down and truly rest. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I want to get eventually into a little bit of some of the practicalities of silence, maybe in a little bit. But you've got a great phrase in your essay that we have to become an apprentice to silence. It's something we have to learn how to do. It doesn't come. You don't just like silence isn't actually just being alone, right? It's something you have to engage in sort of actively. Did you have any thoughts to add, Elizabeth, to what she said?
Just that I think, so I'm high extroversion, high need for stimulation, but I think I probably need silence, therefore more than the people it comes naturally to. And often we can see these different practices within our traditions as like, we're the people that sing with their hands in the air, or we're the people that do liturgy in silence. And I have found the more I'm like, No, I want it all. I want to take all of the wisdom of the church's ponderings over the centuries, and sometimes what I need is to sing with my hands in the air, but sometimes what I need is to go on a silent retreat and not to feel like somehow that's like a betrayal of like the style of our home community or whatever, or that it indicates anything hard or difficult, but that it is a like just broadening the number of plants in your diet.
Mm. Mm. And that has a sort of way of integrating your kind of spirit and your body.
Yeah.
That's great. Shifting gears a little bit, the way both of yours sort of get at your subject matter, both of your essays, like when I first read your piece, Aryana, you know, you're kind of dropped into the world of silence right away, and immediately as you read, you can sort of feel that this is going to be a meditative kind of immersive experience. I've used that word several times already, immersive, but that's sort of what it feels. You're putting yourself in this place, and kind of letting it wash over you. But when I read yours, Elizabeth, you're starting out in central London, right? And you know, it's the techno beat of modernity all around you in the industry, and this very contrastive description of the world you're looking for. And you started out especially with thinking about technology and contrasting it with, you know, the device in your hands, or the one that's like almost sometimes literally strapped to your body. And I think probably most people here are already sympathetic to that line of thought, but you know, a lot of the conversations I have with people who don't spend their time thinking about this kind of stuff for their day job, you know, technology is neutral. It's just a tool. You can use it for good or bad. What, you know, and you say in your essay, technology can liberate, but it also shapes us around its needs to form us toward efficiency. So for maybe, can you give maybe some examples of that happening in your life, or in anybody's life, how that actually works itself out, especially as a sort of frustration to keeping sacred time?
So I find the distinction that Andy Crouch makes in several of his books, I think, between a tool and a device, incredibly helpful. And he talks about a tool is something which participates with our humanity, and requires something of us, whereas a device is something that replaces our humanity. And so a bicycle is a tool because it can help us travel distances, but we're still moving, right? We're still using our bodies. We're still actively engaging. We are building muscles. A car requires something of us, but less. And a driverless car requires nothing of us, and therefore no growth occurs. And when we replace some of our functions as humans, not with tools that might help us do something better, yes, but still require something of us, help us be growing, learning, changing, that part of ourselves can atrophy. And so maps, great tools, right? They help us locate ourselves in space, but we still have to look up and look around at the world and know where we are and follow ourselves on the maps. Digital maps, particularly things like GPS that just like turn left, turn right, for which you have to pay no attention whatsoever to what's happening. They literally shape our neurobiology, the bit of our brain that locates ourselves in space. The hippocampus has shrunk over time because of our use of digital
And you're
maps.
always at the center of that map.
Always at the center of that map, right? It's like the psychogeography of that shift in technology. It's very deep. I heard a terrifying Radio 4 program about how the hippocampus both helps us locate ourselves in space and locate ourselves within our own lives. And so I have like one of my tiny acts of resistance is using physical maps or like letting myself get lost. So I'm like, I don't want to feel disoriented in my own life because I have allowed this technology that was supposed to help me instead shape me the formation has been a loss, not a gain.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had more than one moment of tension in the car where I'm like, let's just not use the GPS, and well, we're gonna be late. Like, well,
Yeah.
then we'll be late. You know, you can see those two kind of sort of worldviews kind of playing out in the space of a marriage sometimes. um, let's see. Um, I love Aryana. I love your Jonah analogy. Or maybe it's an allegorical interpretation, who knows. But that those three moments of being swallowed, sort of dwelling within, and then being spit out. And I wonder if those moments are all necessarily connected, but you sort of have to let each moment be its own sort of moment, like a moment of surrender, even, especially the first moment. You have to let yourself, or God violently takes you down under the surface of the ocean into the whale. But it's once you're down there, you sort of have to let yourself, in the language of a lot of spiritual writers and mystics, you have to let yourself be annihilated. You have to be content with where you are and what God is going to do with you. Jonah sings his hymn of praise in the belly of the whale. It's sort of like he has to accept that he's down there. Do you think that's right? Do you have to sort of give up hope, of being spit out in order to get spit out effectively? Like you can't short circuit the process?
I don't know if you have to give up hope. I do think there's a surrender, and I even write that it is a depth like death. It is a kind of death experience to enter silence every time, which is why it's scary. And but this surrender and this kind of process, actually, it was one of two pieces of advice that I got when I arrived at Grand Champ that has been really helpful. And I'm actually co-leading a silent retreat this weekend and put together a little FAQ document and emphasize these 2 points quite heavily. But the first is that the arrival process is a surrendering process. You have to let yourself arrive with your baggage, with your fear, with your doubts, with your anxious anticipation of what you might hear in the silence. And then the second point being that you can't have a lot of expectations for what will happen in the silence. That's the surrender piece, that you can't expect to feel a particular way. Definitely can't expect an epiphany, or else you might be really disappointed at the end of your silent retreat. You can't expect a God to appear to you in a burning bush. Like, all of these expectations have to be laid at the door of the silent retreat, which is very tied to this process of allowing yourself to arrive. Like, over and over again, the Sisters of Grand Champ just said, just allow yourself to arrive. Don't force it. Don't try to make it look like a particular type of experience. And then even while you're there and present, fully immersed in the silence, fully in the depths of the silent retreat, to allow the Holy Spirit to guide what your body needs, what your prayer looks like, what you do with that time. And I think that's why silence is so hard today, is because we have our skills have atrophied on surrender. Like, we don't know really how to surrender anymore, because we're used to having technology, or the just the different things that are crowding out our lives tell us not to surrender, and make surrender seem like a scary experience.
Yeah, it seems like, yeah, one of the themes that's emerging out of both of your comments and your essays is that this surrender to dependence and to lack of control, like that this the world doesn't depend on us, which is a hard thing to do.
It's if you don't mind, Jeff, it's making me
No, go ahead.
I quote Rowan Williams at the end of my piece, and I think this is where our two pieces really overlap, because he talks about, if you haven't listened to his Reith lectures, his Reith lecture is absolutely amazing, and he thinks this is almost the defining thing of freedom of religion, is how we spend our time. The freedom to spend time and attention to something held to be mysterious, nurturing, elusive, sometimes frustrating, tantalizing, inexhaustible, means the freedom of a contemplative Carmelite nun to gaze in silence at the altar for an hour, the freedom of the Jew on Shabbat, the freedom of a whole community gathered for an hour or two to sing, listen, and articulate what is longed for. It is an extreme version of the freedom we encounter in musical theatre, the freedom that comes from permission not to be useful or productive, not even spiritually productive, right? But just to be human, and to allow that humanity to come for a moment more fully into focus. And I think that unclenching from the claim for our lives to be something in service of something other than themselves, to have, to be a means, not an end, but just to be an end in ourselves, in silence, or in the rhythms of community, is really a profound gift of our tradition.
Yeah, and if just to kind of build on that, the imagery I use, one of the many images I use in the piece is this image of the well, and that surrender process is the emptying of the well. You have to empty everything to be filled up again, and it's, I think that surrender to the waters, the waters that Christ give us, that's much more lasting than anything that we could just, I feel like in our day-to-day, we like are taking our like little shovels and we're like doing these little spoonfuls of water into our well, but it's not really making a dent. And it's when we truly allow ourselves to empty those wells and allow Christ to fill it, that something profound happens.
Yeah. That's really good. As a way of sort of transitioning into maybe some practical questions, I think of this will date me, of course, but a lot of the productivity of these practices comes where they meet up with your will, which wants to do its own thing, right? And I think of the Seinfeld episode where Kramer decides he wants to build some like these levels in his apartment, and Jerry bets him he won't do it. And Kramer decides he doesn't want to do it, and so he says the bet's off. And Jerry says, "No, that's the bet. That you were not going to do it." Like when it comes up to actually pushing up against this thing you don't actually want to do, like you've decided, say you want silence, and you get to like for me, when I get to the monastery, or when you get into your retreat, or when it comes down to making everyday decisions with regard to time and your communal rhythms that you've talked about, Elizabeth, what's the, like, to put it crudely, like what's the life hack, or what's like this one weird trick you can use to when you're ready, when your will meets the point where it actually just says, oh no, I actually don't want to do this. Like when I get to the monastery room and it's like, now it's time to pray, I'm like, well, I don't actually feel like doing that. What practices, what thoughts, how do you deal with that in a sort of in the moment kind of way?
Yeah.
I think this is why I put so much emphasis on communal rhythms, because I
Mhm.
like left to my own devices, I will never get up in the morning and pray.
Mhm.
Like before I physically have to be out of bed. That is not something that comes naturally. I have no desire to do that ever. And living in community with a bunch of people for whom we collectively decided that we would get up and pray morning prayer together at 6:45 has meant that I have had this wonderful trellis and this structure for 2 or 3 years. Like it, I honestly think the accountability of other people is what keeps us living in step with each other. And frankly, I think it's unlikely that you would get to the monastery having like done that outward bodily demonstration of your intention and get in the room and not pray, or not to ignore it completely, because you have created the conditions for yourself. You have set up the trellis for the plant of your attention to lean up against. But I do think the one-way trick is being the brave person to invite others to commit with you. Like it's a really, it came up in the essay that I wrote for comment like a while back on friendship, being the weirdo in the friendship group and going, can we all commit to this communal rhythm? Can we stop having this scheduling nightmare? And we are going to have dinner once a month on this month, and we don't flake unless there's a really good reason and there is like low-level social stigma for it. Can we all agree to that? Because that's we need a strong enough container to hold us, because we will want to flake at various points. And so yeah, the kind of why of knowing that we will not hold ourselves to the practices that we need to stay loyal to our callings or the kind of people we want to be becoming, and therefore locking ourselves into the structures that we need. Basically, how can you restrict your future choices?
Yeah, I thought that's the communal aspect is new to me. I think my experience has much more been in solitary experimentation with silence, and I would break it down into daily, weekly, and either biannually or quarterly experiences with silence. But one point of advice that I thought of was my dentist's advice to me, because I don't like to floss, and my dental hygienist was like, please just start by flossing every other day and then work your way up to every day. And I think with the daily practice of silence, starting with every other day I pray or just sit in silence for 10 minutes, and you work your way up. It doesn't have to be this this dive into the abyss, although I also think just diving into the abyss for a weekend long silent retreat is a great way to start, because it it brings up that thirst to then incorporate it in other ways in your life. So I try and do silence every day, even if it's just 10 minutes in the morning. On Sundays, I've become a little bit more loose with this practice, but for a while I was very strict, where I would go to church in the morning and then I would spend the rest of the day in silence and not on technology, and I would go for a very long walk. And it took a lot of effort to say no to social obligations. And my friends then started to know, like, Aryana's unavailable Saturday or Sunday after church. That's and then as far as the biannual or quarterly, doing it with a friend, going on a silent retreat. One of my friends who I'm co-leading the silent retreat with this weekend, our friendship was born out of us both expressing in a Zoom chat room, hey, I like silence, so do I. And we met and decided to plan a silent retreat. And that kind of accountability that Elizabeth was talking about is crucial to ensuring that and putting it in the calendar and not making any compromises. Like, on this date, 6 months from now, we'll have our second silent retreat.
Elizabeth, thank you for those comments, Aryana. Elizabeth, somebody was asking in the chat about your communal living situation. And I want you to answer that, but first I want to say let's transition to a more Q&A from the audience. And we've already had a few questions, and we'll start drawing from there. I also did drop your essay on the friendship contract into the chat as well, so people can visit that. But yeah, just tell us a little bit about your situation.
Yeah, I'm always slightly hesitant because it can feel like a grandiose claim because we're very small. I call ourselves a micro monastery. Sometimes it's just 2 families of permanent members of the community. But we felt this really strong calling to community, but we have young children and are called through this particular patch of London, and this is where God led us. So we have 2 families. We rented together. We have now bought a house together with the help of about 15 people who believe in the project and have invested in it. And we keep, I'd say, kind of monastic inspired rhythms. So we do morning prayer and compline. We've turned the garage into a chapel. And then our kind of, there's this lovely phrase that Catholic orders often use about their charism, you know, their particular gifting. And I think our particular gifting or calling is to creating a space of where people with questions, who are drawn to Christian spirituality, who are maybe bruised by the church or unsure or have intellectual things they want to talk about, can come and be with us. So we have these big open table dinners, and interestingly, inviting people to come and pray compline is the easiest invite I've ever done. It is the people who come are from very many different backgrounds, perspective, politics, you know, not most of them not Christians, but almost all of them say yes to come and pray compline in the garage, basically. And actually, one of the rhythms we use at the start of those dinners, we call it a Quaker grace. We have like 2 minutes of silence, and we say, this is just so, you know, you can, if you're someone who gives thanks for food, you can give the thanks for the food. We can reflect on the people in the supply line and the plants, and just like notice that we have food in front of us. And lots of people have said that's their favorite thing. They come to Monastery basically to sit in silence with 16 people. And every time we all come in, and we're chatting, we've all had our day, and we sit down and we say, this is the food and you're welcome. And we're just gonna have a few beats of silence. And it's just this beautiful, intimate, tender thing to do with people. It just makes going into those conversations, because they often don't know each other, just softens the way in this beautiful way.
So, and people, have you had anybody be like, whoa, that was weird? Or has the response been universally sort of positive?
Yeah, I mean, they may just not say it. They may not
Yeah,
say
right.
I always frame it with like, this welcome to Monday night dinner. Like, the 2 weird things that are going to happen is we will have silence, and then at the end, if you want to come and pray compline, you're very welcome. To sort of acknowledge that it's a bit awkward, but I've never had anyone say, I really wish you wouldn't do that bit.
Yeah. Kate Brinkert asks about, she says, I'm finding that resistance to surrender seems to be at the core of most of the reasons people, especially in my generation, Gen Z, are uninterested in Christian faith. I'd be curious to hear how your reflections on sacred time and silence translate to that context.
I think what often gets missed in the conversation around surrender, and that I think is good to emphasize now, is that there is an aspect of play and enchantment with the mysteriousness and the beauty of life that can come when you let go of yourself. I sometimes get tired of myself. I get tired of my internal monologue. I get tired of the stressors that I have in my day-to-day life. And so surrender is a way to escape that and then be adopted into a story larger than myself. It's a way to be reminded that there are really beautiful aspects, very beautiful and mysterious aspects of life that are worth attending to. And so I think surrender there could be maybe the wrong connotations for Gen Z, especially around the Christian faith. But I think when it's put in that kind of bigger context of all that surrender can entail, it's not always hard. It can also be light and fun and playful. So that's how I would respond.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know how much I have to add on that, because I haven't. Basically, what's making me think of is that we have this weird ministry where we're often finding, particularly men, some women, who are kind of in very drawn to Christian faith, but tend to be extremely intellectual and just constantly are doing this Rubik's Cube of trying to make, you know, the whole thing makes sense. And they often sort of get so far and then stop because the point of surrender is really difficult. And they're like, I think the sort of ego death of choosing to follow Jesus, you're talking about annihilation. There is a moment of having to say, I am not God and I will follow you instead of myself. And that's very different for particularly for men in their 30s and 40s, who otherwise I'm seeing the most spiritual openness in. So I'm interested to hear that basically I'd like to hear more from you about Gen Z and how that's showing up. I wonder if there's something about a distrust, and because there's so much higher awareness of trauma and harm, and an awareness of the institutions of the church as not always somewhere safe, that actually the surrendering to the divine love, which is a safe, well, not safe, but good thing to do, is masked by the fact that actually it's not always safe to surrender to an institution of the church and to like give away autonomy in that setting.
Yeah, so surrender does not mean surrendering your sort of rational sense of discernment, which is maybe a good qualifier to throw in there with your pitches, your elevator pitches for silence and surrender. There was another question that overlapped with a question I hadn't got to ask yet, so I'll do that one. Elizabeth, you say, have this great line, how much does your local church function as the clock of your community, as a site where the wider population can reset themselves to sacred time by joining its steady and patient rhythms? And where did that question go? Somebody else asked a very similar question, or a similar question along those lines. Sarah Erickson here.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, do you have advice? Or okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I was aware coming into this call that there would be a lot of people doing the incredibly difficult work of pastoring or leading in various different local communities, and it's always so annoying if someone who doesn't have the responsibility is like, this is how you should do it. And I think that's why we've moved into a micro monastery, because I don't know how local church does it now. The book that I quote in the piece by Andrew Root, I think, has got actually quite a lot of concrete suggestions at the end. So I would recommend getting, I think it's called The Church in the Secular Age, The Congregation in the Secular Age. It's a part of a series, but I can follow up with a reference if it's helpful. But yes, he has some more specific, how do you invite a congregation into this role? How do you, without getting into that sort of slightly coercive, heavy shepherding, guilting people into high levels of commitment, how do you invite people into collective rhythms that can be as inviting as I think they are when they're healthy to those around us? Yeah, so I'd point you to him as much more of an expert on this. But I would also say finding people to journey with who do want to commit to collective rhythms, and then having a very porous boundary to those and inviting people. Like we do morning prayer, and we're always like, if you ever want to join morning prayer at 6:45 a.m. in a garage, you're very welcome. And it's remarkable how many people do go, actually, I would really like that. And they don't, come regularly, but just popping in and being like, they know that on Monday morning we will be there, seems to be some sort of blessing.
All right, one more question. I'll just read this from Fritz Heinzen. Both of our guests have advice useful for so many, even society as a whole, but trying to promote such advice seems to require almost one-to-one encouragement with individuals. Have either of you talked with or written for larger groups of influencers? For example, healthcare professionals, more specifically, mental health practitioners, or corporate leadership or religious leadership in various denominations, etc.
I love this. I love this question.
Yes, it's probably over you, Aryana.
I love this question because if there's any donors who would like to fund my retreat center that I'd like to open in the next 5 to 10 years, that is exactly one vision I hope to somehow bring about. And actually, I think it's funny, Fritz, that you mentioned U.S. Congress, because I've had that exact idea of what would it look like to take the leaders of our nation and plop them in the middle of the wilderness without their phones and without their computers for just, honestly, probably just 2 days would be enough to
Or more.
really,
We can do
or
more.
more. Yeah, I mean, maybe a year.
Got
They
to
need
keep that team
they
set
need a
up.
whole year out there. But and especially for people who are influencers, they're, as much as they're producing content, they are also consuming high levels of content. And when they get invited to a retreat, it's often to listen to another speaker and to consume more information. And so I think there is a huge gap in space and need for retreat centers or professionals who help walk people through this experience, which maybe one day I will get to do.
Nothing to
Elizabeth,
add.
you have any thoughts
Listen
to
to Aryana.
add? Well, good. It's 12:58. That hour went incredibly fast. I wish we had longer. But thank you both. Thank you all for coming and joining us as we talk about this. As you go on your way, practice silence, find ways to practice silence and time, and if you and communal rhythms especially. If you come up with any ideas, drop us a line at Comment Magazine. We always love to hear what you're thinking. We will follow up this event with a link to the recording. I think it'll be on YouTube eventually. We'll also follow up with a list of resources. Elizabeth and Aryana, if you think of things that books or articles you've mentioned, write them down, and we'll get you a list of follow-up material if you're interested in reading more and listening more, watching more. Unless Mariah gives me some kind of flare, I will say goodbye. Thank you again all for coming, and we'll see you at the next one. Thank you, Aryana and Elizabeth, for joining us today. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Lovely to see you all.